Welcome back to part 2 of our interview with author Kayleen Reusser. She's talking about her book, Born to be Soldiers, Those Plucky Women of World War II.
Where Ruth Licking was, she joined the Army, and so she became a WAC, but she had been working in a dime store. And she was extremely patriotic, and she wanted to do something for her country. But boy, her mother was not happy. She had originally wanted to go to Detroit, Michigan to work in a munitions factory. And her mother said, oh no, that's too far away and too big of a city. So she joined the Army instead. So I thought, oh my goodness. And Marty's mother was so put off by her joining the WASP that she wouldn't even come out on the front porch to say goodbye to her. And Marty she told that to me. It wasn't even in her letters. I didn't read one letter that referred to that, but she did tell me in person that really was a big moment for Marty. But she told her dad, who did come out on the porch, she said, you're going to have to tell Mom that I'm doing this, whether she likes it or not. And, I think then in the letters, I think Marty just didn't have time to dwell on it. She was just there to do as good as she could. And she was a college graduate, as I mentioned, but the other two WASP that I interviewed were not. One of them was Margaret Ray Ringenberg, who just happened to be featured in Tom Brokaw's book, The Greatest Generation, which is now 20 years old. I can't even hardly believe that. Maybe it's even more than 20. She was not a college graduate, but yet she went on to fly more than 40,000 miles. She had said, when I interviewed her, that she felt very inadequate when she was there. She had gotten her 35 hours, just like all the others. She paid for it herself, but she felt very inadequate compared to the other women who were there, who were college graduates. And yet, she had it. She had it going. She understood it as well as they did. But, and the women, as far as I knew, always got along in every branch. I didn't read that there was really much competition because they were there for a common purpose, and that was to help their country win the war. So they weren't going to be competing against each other and trying to do any damage because they wanted to get the war over with and get on with their lives. All of their men were overseas, or at least a lot of them. We had 16 million men and women in the military. So 16 million, yeah, and they're just about all gone. Very sorry to say that, because I miss all of these gals. Of the 13, 2 are still living. If I can mention, I will say that one of them that is still living is this gal right here. Her name is Eileen. Well, it's Doris. Her middle name was Eileen, which is what she went by. Stuckey was her maiden name. And then Zeisig was her maiden name or married name. And she became an Army nurse. She is 100. She just turned 100 last summer. And when the book came out in February, she agreed to do a Facebook Live event with me, which we did in her little villa. And she was fabulous. It was a 40-minute interview, and she did great. I learned things that I could have put into the book if I hadn't known them. But
so, is that on your Facebook page? Can we?
It should be March 10th,
2022.
I also have created a YouTube channel, which I have put it on there. There are normally very short interviews with veterans, and I'm saying like under a minute. In fact, there's one here. I should mention the third gal. This is Lorraine Hook Davis, and she was in the Coast Guard. And by the way, all 3 of these are college graduates. So they were officers when they went into the military. They still had to do basic training or boot camp. And Eileen says, imagine all of us nurses doing boot camp, because she had already been working. So I could go on. I'll button up.
Well, I could listen to you continue to talk on and on about these women, and as I was reading this and knowing I was going to get to talk to you again, I couldn't figure out how to describe these women. It's courageous. Yes, they're courageous. Like brave. Yes. But I finally came to me selfless, because they, when the conflict happened, they were like, how can I help?
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't think just locally. It was broad, where I would maybe be like, oh, I'll have a victory garden, or, no,
Yes.
They went out, and many of them had never been away from home ever, and here they're moving hundreds and hundreds of miles away with a bunch of women they don't know. Selfless.
They were. In fact, I will mention a certain family, Charlotte Koch Eisenhart. She was the oldest of four sisters, four daughters. She had three sisters. So she was the oldest. She joined the Army. So she became, yes, there she is.
Right here.
Yes. And then she had three sisters. Her youngest two sisters worked in factories in Fort Wayne building. I'm not sure exactly, but I think they built trucks. There were factories that built planes that women worked in. They might have built or constructed guns, bullets, even just parts of things that went to something for the war effort. So they would have been called Rosie the Riveters, or Rosies, as we commonly call them, but not until many, many decades later, but just to recognize their efforts for the war. But they stayed home, which was fine. And then Charlotte had another sister who also joined the WWII. And I do not have any other woman that I've interviewed that had another sister who was in the military. More often, it was where the women had brothers. Like Eileen had three brothers who were in the military. So there were a total of four of them. But Charlotte's sister did go overseas. The WWII could be sent overseas. She went to the South Pacific. So there were a few letters found when Charlotte passed away, not when I interviewed her. This would have been a couple years later. When she had passed, some family members found a dusty box of letters. And I'm thinking, oh, so thank you for not throwing those away, because there were letters between her and her sister who was overseas. And it was written on V-mail. Do you know what V-mail is?
No.
I need to do an official research on this, but the weight of sending letters back and forth across the oceans was getting to be too much. I mean, they were encouraging people at home to write to their veterans, to their troops overseas, their family members, because that was needed to keep up their morale. But the weight was just considerable. So the military came up with a very condensed version. They would have been very small. And in fact, they took the original and actually made them smaller purposely. So sometimes you could read it. And so I can't read them very well. But I did have one that her sister, whose nickname was Snooks, wrote back and forth. And I just can't help but think what a bond those two sisters would have had with both of them serving in the military at the same time, the same branch even. So that was special. So there was 3 levels there of service, which I would never, ever say one of them was greater than the other, because they were all absolutely needed. So Charlotte actually was sent to Seattle, to the port of embarkation there, and she was there so early that they were billeted in a hotel, which sounds very glamorous, but they took out the nice beds and put in army cots. And Charlotte was one of those who was there to help assemble the army cots. So she worked in a administrative job as a secretary. And she was very proud and did the best she could do. She had also worked in a department store prior to joining the Army. So she had a lot of supervisory skills, which she did. She used a lot of her leadership skills in this very responsible position. She worked for a general. So she was seeing some things. She had to keep her mouth shut about everything. So it was just amazing to think these women had all these stories, and I was sometimes the first person who would ever talk to them about it. Which, yeah, I feel very proud to have had the honor to talk with them. And I think that as far as the men, I think for them, sometimes they had not wanted to talk about difficult things. But I wonder with the women, were they just so humble that they just didn't feel like they had done as much as the men? In fact, Eileen Zeizig, who's here on the cover, the Army nurse, she definitely felt like the men had been the ones to do the most. And I said, oh, Eileen, when I've interviewed the men, they considered the medics and their nurses to be with a halo thing going on right here. There was no doubt in their minds how they felt about Army nurses or military nurses, let's just say. But the women were so selfless in other ways too. Charlotte Eisenhart was stationed at Seattle's port of embarkation. She was a secretary there for a general, and she felt like she had everything she needed. She had her room and board taken care of. Now, board is her meals. She felt like beautiful uniforms to wear. These women were very proud to take care of their uniforms, which they would have probably had to iron, which just sounds horrible to me. I put ironing aside years ago. She felt like she had all she needed. If she did need to go get something, she could, but she didn't have a lot of room. They were sharing rooms with other women. So she sent part of her earnings, her paycheck, back home to her family, because she did have younger brothers. They would have been too young to go into the war. And her family was also observing rationing, like all of America and even most of Europe was rationed on different things like food and toilet paper and things just like we have in recent years. There's so many parallels to what we've gone through with the COVID that I feel like, boy, we could learn so much from these people. You will survive. It feels like it'll never end, but you will. So she just wanted to help her family. And I thought, how many times do we hear somebody say, I have all I need. I don't need anything else. I don't hear it very often. We're always needing to either save our money or invest it or make sure that it pays for itself, and so we can get more and more. So those kinds of examples she wasn't the only woman that did that. I occasionally had a man tell me that too, but it was more striking for me that the women, because when they went, they couldn't take much with them. They couldn't take civilian clothing. You couldn't wear civilian clothing while you were in the military. So it was quite an example for me.
And as I was reading, and you kind of share a little bit about like what happened to them, after their service, mm-hmm. how many kids they had. And I thought, I wonder how many people in their circles that, were younger, that had no idea what they gave up and how patriotic these women were.
Mm-hmm. The women told me the same thing that the men had told me, that they didn't talk about the war afterwards. And for a lot of them, they would have been, I can't think of the word right now, they would have stuck out in their circle of women friends. They would have been very different. In fact, I did a talk a few weeks ago of somebody who knew Lorraine Davis. They had known her, of course, when she was elderly. They never knew she was in the military. And she was in cryptography, which was codes. She was probably a brainiac. I mean, I think all of the women were, but really exceptional. And and for many of them, they had that mindset. I can't talk about it because I wasn't allowed to talk about it, even for many years after the war. They were not, especially with codes. So she just probably felt like she had to keep it quiet. Sometimes I've even had family members tell me things that they had not known. And they haven't looked a lot into how to research their family's history. So I feel like that's a real honor to know some things that might help a family or interest a family more than they were before.
Please join us next week as we continue our interview with author Kayleen Reusser on her book, Born to be Soldiers, Those Plucky Women of World War II.